In this video, we will assemble shaft number 1, which consists of a 12-inch shaft, pillow block risers, pillow block bearings, hardware 3/8 bolt, 4.5 inch long, and spur gear number 4 on the gear panel number 1. This is number 4, and it's listed on the panel as number 4. We'll put these together in pretty much the standard way we've always been doing this, which is set up, first of all, 4 bearings. And of course the bearings, I usually like to pull off the rings first and align them for the rings inside. Then we take our hardware and drop it in. And I'll go ahead and proceed to do this. To align these up, drop, come up from underneath, and kind of loosely attach, first of all, the flat washer, then lock washer, then nut from underneath. Now I've got all 4 sets of hardware installed, but I leave this somewhat loose, not quite snug. The next thing to do is to insert the shaft through the bearings, make sure that it easily goes to the bearings. And if these are all properly aligned, it should be able to slide back and forth fairly readily. So you can see, moves quite well, freely. That's the goal. If it does not move freely, it means these bearings are binding. We don't want it to bind. If there's any real binding, if there's a problem inserting in the first place, usually it's a bit of roughness. But once it's inserted, it should readily line up with the next bearing over. Once we assume that it moves like this, back it out. It's time to at least put the rings on the shaft. Don't forget to do that. And it should have 2 set screws to them. Insert in a bearing and just let it sit here. The next move is to level our shaft. And for this, put the level bubble down. And I can see that the bubble here is a little bit to my left or your right, so I'm going to have to raise this end ever so slightly. Not quite enough shim there. That was a 0.0015. If I use a 0.004, doesn't quite bring it in either. I'm going to have to go to a slightly larger shim mass. And that lines up, the bubble just about perfect. That's a 0.006. Since I had to raise this end up at 0.006, I have to shim these 2 bolts from underneath the risers. But of course we still have our shim ratio. Length of this is about 3 inches. Since we're going to put the full length down, 3 inches and about 6 inches. So our shim ratio is 2. 2 times 0.006 is 0.012. So I should put about 4 0.003 shims, and that will raise this end sufficiently to level off this shaft. So let me go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and put my calculated shims, stacks of them underneath these 2 bolts to raise this part of the shaft up. And now as I check the level again, the bubble is right where it should be, right dead center. The next step for us will be, of course, to loosely put on the bearings here. And even that, I'm not too concerned with so much at the moment. But I'll go ahead and put these on. And for this, ordinarily we go ahead and tighten these bolts. Except I do want to leave these things floating and loose so that when we put the next load shaft on, over on the side, over here, then we'll be able to move this around to mat and fold. In building up a system with multiple shafts, I wouldn't necessarily tighten everything down to begin with. So our next step is really going to be to put the spur gear, and this is spur gear number 4 off gear panel number 1. There's a place in it. You can see that there is we simply back out. You can see there, nothing in the key seat. We back out this Allen, the set screw, until we have a clear key seat, so we can put it on, gear out on the shaft, right over where the key is. Don't forget the key. Very important to put a 3/16 key in there. So we'll go ahead and put the key in here. Then we'll put the spur gear on. Then we'll go ahead and tighten down the gear tooth. So here I put the key in the key seat on the shaft. Then I put the spur gear right onto it. Then once the spur gear is on, I can go ahead and tighten down the set screw using an Allen wrench. And that will hold the spur gear in place. At this point, I've still left the mounting fairly loose here. Mounting fairly loose, a little bit loose, so I can move it around as necessary. The shaft can move in and out, so I can line it up with the next shaft assembly number 2. And so our next step is to mount shaft assembly 2 in much the same way we just did this shaft.